The city exists before the man does. Concrete corridors, low ceilings, streets that never fully rest. It is a territory shaped by repetition, by habits learned under pressure. Violence is not an interruption here, it is an undertone. Law is present, but mostly as architecture, courthouses, uniforms, procedures. Justice operates at a distance, abstracted into systems meant to absorb chaos without ever truly touching it. This is the environment that produces Frank Castle long before he becomes visible within it. A world where order depends on containment rather than resolution. Crime is managed, not eliminated. Suffering is cataloged, not answered. The city functions because it assumes limits, ethical limits, procedural limits, emotional limits. It survives by agreeing that some losses are acceptable. Before the war arrives at his door, Frank Castle fits inside this structure. He is not exceptional. He is disciplined, loyal, functional. He belongs to institutions built to absorb violence on behalf of others. His relationship with force is regulated, legitimized, framed as necessary. War exists somewhere else. It has borders, uniforms, declared enemies. It ends, at least on paper. What matters here is not the trauma itself, but the moral architecture surrounding it. The world Frank inhabits believes in transitions, from war to peace, from chaos to order, from loss to mourning. It assumes that time heals because time moves forward. The system relies on this assumption to remain stable. Frank Castle is a man shaped by continuity. His identity is built on duty, hierarchy, clarity of roles. There is a chain of command, a logic of engagement. Violence has a purpose and an endpoint. Even death has context. The world asks him to carry out unbearable acts, but promises that meaning will follow. The opening fracture does not announce itself as catastrophe. It arrives as collapse of continuity, a rupture in the assumption that violence can be contained within rules. When his family is killed, the event itself is brutal, but the deeper shock is structural. The war does not stay where it belongs. It crosses the boundary. This is the moment the system fails, not legally but symbolically. There is no language capable of translating this loss into something acceptable. The mechanisms designed to process suffering reveal their limits. Investigations stall. Responsibility diffuses. Justice becomes procedural again, distant, delayed, diluted by complexity. Frank does not experience grief as absence. He experiences it as pressure, a constant weight that refuses to disperse. The city moves on. Institutions continue functioning. People adapt. He does not because he is emotional, but because he remains consistent. The world expects transformation. He remains fixed. This is where the ethical tension begins, long before the skull appears. The conflict is not yet about killing criminals. It is about incompatibility between a man who cannot compartmentalize violence and a society that depends on compartmentalization to survive. The city operates through shadows. Crimes are hidden, negotiated, absorbed into patterns. Power circulates quietly. Criminal networks function as parallel structures, unofficial but stable. They are tolerated because they are predictable. They have boundaries. They maintain balance through fear and exchange. Frank Castle represents something the city cannot metabolize. Not chaos, but excess clarity. He does not negotiate. He does not absorb. He does not convert violence into abstraction. He treats every act as final. Every crime as personal. Every death is irreversible. In this sense, his emergence is not rebellion. It is exposure. He brings into the open what the system requires to remain partially hidden. The city's moral economy depends on selective blindness. Frank refuses blindness altogether. Before he becomes a symbol, he is a disturbance, an anomaly moving through familiar territory, ignoring unwritten rules. Criminals do not fear law enforcement because it is bound by structure. They fear unpredictability, but only within limits. Frank offers something else. He offers inevitability. There is no negotiation with inevitability, no appeal, no delay. His presence collapses the space criminals rely on to survive. Corners disappear. Shadows shrink. Territory becomes exposed. This is why the opening movement of his story is not defined by action, but by atmosphere. The sense that something has entered the system that cannot be integrated. The city feels heavier. The rules feel thinner. The boundaries that once separated war from peace begin to erode. Frank Castle does not announce a new order. He does not articulate an ideology. He does not recruit. He does not seek validation. His silence is part of the disturbance. It leaves no space for reinterpretation. What begins to unsettle the city is not the number of bodies, but the absence of justification. Violence without narrative. Death without spectacle. Punishment without ritual. The skull will come later. First comes the vacuum. This opening sequence is not about revenge. It is about incompatibility between two ethical systems occupying the same space. One depends on limits, delay, abstraction. The other operates through totalization. No margins, no exceptions. The war Frank Castle cannot stop is not the one that took his family. It is the one that revealed itself afterward. A war between containment and exposure. Between systems that survive by managing violence and a man who has lost the ability to manage it at all. The city does not yet understand what is happening. It still believes this disturbance can be corrected, neutralized, folded back into familiar patterns. It assumes this is temporary. It is not. The foundations are already cracked. The conflict is already inscribed. The war has crossed the border, and borders do not easily reassert themselves once they fail. This is the world before the Punisher becomes visible. A system still pretending it can absorb what is coming. A city unaware that it is about to confront a mirror it cannot look away from. Frank Castle does not emerge from nowhere. He is produced by a sequence of structures that precede him and outlast him. Family, military, nation, city. Each offers a promise of meaning through alignment. Belong to this unit. Follow these rules. Carry this weight, and it will count for something. His early narrative is defined by coherence. Identity flows outward from function. He knows who he is because his role is clear. The military is not simply a background detail. It is the first ethical architecture that shapes him completely. It offers a universe where violence is not only permitted but necessary, where killing is framed as service rather than rupture. More importantly, it provides boundaries. Enemies are named. Missions are finite. Responsibility is distributed across command. When harm is inflicted, it belongs to the system as much as to the individual. Frank thrives in this environment because it externalizes moral complexity. The burden of judgment is lifted. Action replaces reflection. Loyalty replaces ambiguity. The soldier does not ask whether violence is right, only whether it is required. This does not make him unthinking. It makes him aligned. Family then becomes the second structure, operating as counterweight rather than contradiction. It anchors him to civilian life without challenging the logic of force. Love and domestic stability offer relief, not transformation. They do not ask him to reinterpret who he is, only to pause between deployments. War and home exist as alternating territories, each giving meaning to the other. This balance is fragile but functional. It depends entirely on separation. Violence belongs elsewhere. Innocence belongs here. The city exists as neutral ground, governed by laws rather than battlefields. Frank Castle's identity is coherent because these spaces do not overlap. The moment his family is murdered, that separation collapses. Not symbolically, but structurally. The battlefield appears inside the sanctuary. Violence no longer respects geography. The enemy is no longer external, foreign, declared. It is local, intimate, faceless. This is where grief becomes something other than loss. It becomes reorganization. Frank does not mourn by dissolving. He mourns by reassembling himself around a single axis. Continuity. The war did not end. It merely changed location. The city attempts to absorb this event through its usual mechanisms. Police reports, court proceedings, delays justified by process. Responsibility dispersed across jurisdictional cracks. From the system's perspective, this is functioning as intended. Justice is slow because it must be careful. Violence must be translated into procedure to prevent escalation. For Frank, this translation is experienced as erasure. The specificity of the crime is dissolved into abstraction. Names become files. Faces become evidence. The emotional weight that demands response is flattened by distance. The system survives by removing immediacy. Frank cannot. This is not because he is impatient or irrational. It is because his internal ethical structure has been trained to treat violence as requiring direct engagement. In war, delay is death. In war, clarity matters. In war, inaction carries moral weight. The incompatibility sharpens here. The city treats violence as something to be managed collectively over time. Frank treats it as something that demands immediate containment through force. Both claim moral legitimacy. Only one can operate without restraint. What begins to form is not a desire for revenge, but a refusal of mediation. Frank rejects any structure that places distance between act and consequence. He begins to reconstruct his identity around direct causality. Crime leads to punishment. Harm leads to elimination of the source. The logic is brutal, but internally consistent. Criminal networks within the city operate through a different kind of abstraction. They rely on diffusion, layers of insulation, the boss who never pulls the trigger, the system that allows violence to exist without ownership. These structures mirror the city's own mechanisms in distorted form. Power without visibility, harm without accountability. Frank's emerging role positions him against both systems simultaneously. He is not simply attacking criminals. He is attacking insulation itself. Every intermediary becomes a target. Every layer is stripped away. He collapses hierarchies by refusing to recognize them. This is where the symbolic shape of the Punisher begins to take form. Not as costume or emblem, but as function. He becomes a force that moves vertically rather than horizontally. He does not negotiate territory. He penetrates it. He does not destabilize by chaos, but by precision. The skull that will later mark him is not a mask. It is a warning, not to frighten, but to clarify. There is no ambiguity here, no message beyond inevitability. This is violence without ritual, without narrative justification beyond outcome. Psychologically, this represents a shift from identity to role. Frank Castle ceases to exist as a person situated among others. He becomes an instrument. The war no longer serves a cause. The war becomes the cause. This transformation is not experienced by him as loss of humanity. It is experienced as preservation. Humanity, as offered by the city, failed. The system that promised safety proved incapable of defending what mattered. To remain human, as he understands it, he must abandon the structures that betrayed that promise. The audience encounters this foundation with discomfort, because it refuses easy moral categorization. Frank is not insane. He is not confused. He is not motivated by pleasure. His actions emerge from coherence taken to its extreme. This is the ethical core of the character, a man whose internal alignment survives catastrophe intact, while the world around him fractures. He does not adapt to the new order. He imposes continuity upon it. The conflict is now inevitable. The city cannot tolerate a force that refuses mediation. Criminals cannot survive exposure without insulation. Institutions cannot function if individuals bypass process entirely. Frank Castle stands at the intersection of these pressures. The stage is set. The forces are aligned. The war that could once be located elsewhere is now embedded in the city's streets, walls, and shadows. What follows is not escalation born of emotion, but expansion driven by structural necessity. The conflict has not yet fully revealed itself, but its logic is already complete. The first visible phase of the conflict does not arrive as spectacle. It unfolds as correction. Frank Castle does not announce himself as an alternative order. He moves through existing structures and removes what he perceives as malfunctioning components. The early actions are targeted, almost surgical. Small crews, peripheral operators, spaces already known to law enforcement, but tolerated through delay and negotiation. This matters because it defines the initial ethical ambiguity. From a distance, his actions resemble what the system claims to want but cannot execute. Criminals who were meant to be prosecuted are eliminated. Cases that would have taken years are closed in seconds. Violence, which the city pretends to be exceptional, is treated as a constant and answered accordingly. At this stage, the city does not resist him openly. Law enforcement responds with confusion rather than opposition. There is an unspoken recognition that the outcomes align with institutional desire even as the method violates every rule sustaining it. Frank operates in the margins created by this hesitation. Criminal networks feel the shift first. The usual patterns stop working. Bribes fail. Informants disappear. Threats lose their leverage. What destabilizes them is not fear alone, but loss of predictability. Violence, which once flowed through controlled channels, now returns directly to its source. Frank does not expand horizontally. He moves upward. He follows money, command, proximity to decision. The logic is simple. Those who authorize harm are more responsible than those who execute it. This reverses the usual moral distribution of the criminal world, where the lowest bodies absorb the greatest risk. Symbolically, this movement represents an assault on the idea of insulation. Frank treats every structure as permeable. Walls do not protect. Titles do not deflect. Distance does not absolve. The city's hidden architecture is exposed by pressure rather than investigation. For the public, this phase generates unease mixed with relief. The narrative is incomplete, fragmented by rumor and selective reporting. Bodies appear without context. Patterns are suspected, but not confirmed. Media struggles to frame the events without legitimizing them. The absence of a manifesto complicates interpretation. Frank offers no explanation. Without language, the violence resists ideological capture. It cannot be easily labeled as terrorism or vigilantism because it lacks performative intent. It does not seek an audience. It produces consequences. This frustrates the city's systems of meaning. Power depends on visibility, on the ability to narrate events in ways that preserve authority. Frank's refusal to speak denies the system that control. He becomes a moving blind spot, visible only through aftermath. Internally, this phase marks the solidification of his role. Doubt does not vanish, but it becomes irrelevant. His actions are no longer about restoring what was lost. They are about preventing repetition. Every criminal eliminated becomes a proxy for the original rupture. This is where the ethical structure hardens. The logic shifts from response to preemption. If violence is inevitable, then waiting becomes complicity. Frank begins to operate on projected futures rather than documented crimes. He eliminates not only what has happened, but what will happen. This escalation is subtle at first. Targets are still defensible. Their guilt is obvious. The audience can still map cause to effect without strain. The moral discomfort remains latent, postponed by clarity of outcome. Law enforcement begins to reorganize around him. Task forces are created, not because he threatens civilians, but because he threatens monopoly. Violence, to remain legitimate, must belong to the state. Frank's presence exposes that legitimacy as conditional rather than inherent. The city's response reveals its own fracture. Officers who have spent years navigating compromise experience his actions as vindication. Others see him as contamination. The line between justice and vengeance begins to blur, not in Frank's mind, but in the institution's reflection. Criminals respond by adapting. They retreat deeper into networks. They fragment. They outsource. Violence becomes more chaotic as centralized control weakens. Ironically, Frank's precision creates collateral instability. The system he dismantles was brutal but ordered. Its collapse produces unpredictability. This feeds the narrative tension. Frank is no longer simply removing harm. He is reshaping the environment in which harm emerges. The war he continues to fight no longer resembles the one he understands. Symbolically, the city becomes a shifting battlefield without fronts. Territory loses meaning. Safe zones dissolve. Power migrates constantly. Frank's vertical movement destabilizes the horizontal logic of crime, but offers no replacement structure. At the end of this first movement, the conflict has crossed an invisible threshold. Frank Castle is no longer an anomaly. He is a factor. Every decision within the criminal ecosystem now accounts for him. His presence alters behavior even when he is absent. The city cannot return to its previous equilibrium. Too much has been exposed. Too many intermediaries removed. The assumption that violence can be contained within predictable channels has been broken. What began as correction now demands interpretation. The system must decide whether to absorb this force, destroy it, or redefine itself around it. Neutrality is no longer possible. The war has taken shape. The second movement begins when precision is no longer enough. The initial phase depended on clarity, on targets whose guilt required no interpretation. That clarity does not last. Criminal systems adapt faster than moral frameworks. As hierarchies collapse, responsibility becomes harder to locate. Decision-making fragments. Violence decentralizes. Frank Castle finds himself moving through a landscape where causality is no longer linear. This is the point where the war stops resembling correction and starts resembling occupation. Frank no longer enters spaces to remove specific threats. He begins to dominate territory through presence alone. Safe houses are abandoned before he arrives. Operations dissolve based on rumor. Entire networks relocate without confirmation. Fear becomes ambient rather than reactive. Symbolically, this marks a shift from force as response to force as environment. Frank becomes less an actor within the city and more a condition the city must endure. His influence expands beyond his actions. He shapes behavior without contact. This is power in its purest form, not exercised through command, but through inevitability. For Frank, this expansion carries cost. The logic that once guided him becomes harder to apply. When criminal activity fragments, the distinction between cause and consequence blurs. Eliminating one node no longer produces meaningful reduction in harm. Violence reappears elsewhere, less organized, more erratic. This destabilization does not weaken his resolve. It intensifies it. The absence of clear endpoints confirms his deepest conviction that the war has no natural conclusion. If the system regenerates endlessly, then restraint becomes irrational. The only coherent response is persistence. Here, his ethical framework begins to invert. Early actions were grounded in retribution for specific harm. Now action is justified by probability. Potential replaces proof. Suspicion replaces certainty. Frank is no longer responding to crimes. He is acting against patterns. This is where the moral gravity increases. Not because he becomes cruel, but because the structure he inhabits demands expansion to remain coherent. To stop would require accepting limits. Limits would imply that some harm is tolerable. That concession is impossible for him. The city's institutions respond with increased force. Surveillance expands. Militarized units are deployed. Frank's existence pushes the system toward the very militarization it publicly rejects. The boundary between policing and warfare erodes. This convergence is not accidental. Frank operates as an externalization of impulses the system already contains but refuses to acknowledge. Control through overwhelming force. Deterrence through fear. Suppression rather than resolution. His actions reveal the system's latent desires by enacting them without pretense. As the city hardens, so does Frank. Encounters become more confrontational. Collateral damage increases, not through carelessness, but through compression. Spaces shrink. Options disappear. Every operation feels heavier, more absolute. Public perception fractures. Early ambiguity gives way to polarization. Some view him as necessary, others as existential threat. The narrative no longer centers on crime reduction, but on legitimacy. Who has the right to decide who lives and dies? Frank does not participate in this debate. His silence functions as refusal. He does not seek consent. He does not require it. The war, as he experiences it, is not democratic. It is mechanical. Pressure applied until resistance fails. Psychologically, this is the phase where identity collapses into function completely. Frank Castle, the man, recedes. The Punisher becomes dominant, not as persona, but as operating principle. Sleep, hunger, pain, isolation lose narrative significance. They are variables to be managed. This reduction is not dehumanization in the conventional sense. It is concentration. Every aspect of his being aligns toward continuation. Doubt becomes noise. Memory becomes fuel. There is no room for alternative futures. Criminals begin to mirror his logic. Smaller groups adopt extreme measures. Retaliation escalates. Violence becomes more spectacular, more indiscriminate. Not because Frank inspires imitation, but because he eliminates moderation. Survival favors extremity. The city's moral center erodes under this pressure. Institutions justify increasingly severe tactics. Civil liberties shrink. Exceptional measures become normalized. The presence of Frank Castle provides rationale for actions that would otherwise be unacceptable. Symbolically, the battlefield expands beyond alleys and warehouses into public consciousness. The war reshapes how violence is imagined. It no longer feels distant or containable. It feels structural. At the end of this movement, the conflict reaches a point of saturation. The original justification, protection of the innocent, becomes harder to trace. Outcomes are diffuse. Violence produces more violence, not in direct exchange, but as ambient condition. Frank does not retreat from this realization. He absorbs it. If the war contaminates everything, then everything becomes part of the war. This conclusion is not despairing. It is clarifying. The conflict is no longer about criminals versus victims, or vigilante versus system. It is about whether any structure can survive total moral coherence without destroying the space it occupies. The answer is approaching, but it will not arrive gently. The third movement begins when saturation turns into reflection. Not introspection in the emotional sense, but structural feedback. The environment Frank Castle has reshaped starts to respond in ways that no longer align with his original internal logic. Violence no longer behaves as an enemy to be reduced. It behaves as a condition that reorganizes itself around him. At this stage, Frank is no longer destabilizing a criminal order. He is participating in a closed circuit of escalation. Each action produces adaptive responses that confirm his premise while simultaneously undermining its effectiveness. The war proves endless not only because crime persists, but because the methods used to fight it now contribute to its persistence. This is the moment where inevitability becomes visible, not as fate, but as system behavior. Frank confronts a reality where total commitment does not produce total control. It produces compression, pressure that forces transformation without resolution. Criminal structures now anticipate him not tactically, but philosophically. They abandon hierarchy altogether. Leadership becomes disposable. Operations decentralize into cells with minimal communication. Accountability dissolves completely. Violence becomes less instrumental and more expressive. It sends messages rather than achieving outcomes. Frank's logic encounters resistance it cannot eliminate because it is no longer embodied in identifiable targets. Harm becomes ambient, dispersed across countless small decisions made by individuals who no longer see themselves as part of a larger structure. The enemy has become fog. Symbolically, this is the collapse of vertical warfare. There is no higher level to reach, no command center to penetrate. Frank's upward movement encounters emptiness. The architecture he once dismantled has flattened itself in response. This does not produce hesitation. It produces expansion. Frank adapts by broadening his criteria. Suspicion deepens. Thresholds lower. The distinction between participant and facilitator erodes. Anyone who sustains the ecosystem becomes implicated. Here, the ethical gravity shifts decisively. The war is no longer about response or prevention. It is about purification, not moral cleansing in a religious sense, but elimination of conditions that allow harm to exist at all. This is where the audience's discomfort peaks, not because Frank becomes monstrous, but because his coherence remains intact while its consequences become untenable. He has not betrayed his values. He has followed them to their logical extreme. The city now treats him as primary threat, not because of collateral damage alone, but because he exposes the system's impotence. Every failure to stop him highlights institutional limits. Every escalation validates his premise that only force functions decisively. This produces a strange symmetry. Frank and the state begin to resemble each other more closely than either resembles the criminal world they claim to oppose. Surveillance intensifies. Force is preemptive. Justification becomes retrospective. Exceptional measures normalize. The war, once externalized onto Frank, is now internalized by the city itself. The logic he embodies infects policy, rhetoric, and response. His presence accelerates trends already latent, pushing them into visibility. Psychologically, this is the phase where Frank's interior world becomes almost irrelevant to the analysis. His motivations no longer explain the consequences. The system he operates within now exceeds him. He is both driver and symptom. Encounters with law enforcement shift tone. There is less pursuit, more containment. Less moral outrage, more strategic calculation. Frank is no longer framed as aberration. He is treated as natural disaster, something to be managed rather than judged. This reframing strips the conflict of its last moral narrative. The question is no longer whether Frank is right or wrong. It is whether he can be neutralized without dismantling the very structures meant to contain him. Criminals exploit this paralysis. They disappear into civilian spaces. They camouflage themselves within legitimate economies. The line between crime and survival blurs. Frank responds by collapsing that distinction entirely. This is the most dangerous convergence. When survival itself becomes suspicious, the war consumes the social fabric. Trust erodes. Fear spreads laterally. The city becomes a field of potential targets rather than a network of shared spaces. Symbolically, territory dissolves into zones of risk. There are no safe centers, no peripheries. The battlefield is everywhere and nowhere. Frank moves through it as constant, not anomaly. At this stage, the skull is no longer a warning. It is an icon of permanence. It signifies that the war does not require justification because it no longer seeks outcome. It persists because stopping would imply acceptance of limits. Frank Castle cannot accept limits without invalidating his entire structure of meaning. To stop would be to admit that some losses must be absorbed without answer, that some harm must remain unpunished, that violence can be endured rather than eradicated. This is the final internal lock. Not rage, not despair, not obsession, consistency, a refusal to allow the world to redefine what violence means. The third movement closes not with climax, but with crystallization. The conflict has reached a stable form, a state where all participants are trapped within logics they cannot abandon without collapse. Frank remains operational. The city remains functional. Crime persists in altered form. No one wins. No one exits. The war does not escalate further because it no longer needs to. It has become the environment. What follows is not resolution, but interpretation. Once the conflict reaches this state of permanence, it exceeds the boundaries of narrative and enters cultural circulation. Frank Castle no longer functions only as a character within a story. He becomes a symbolic instrument through which society negotiates its relationship with violence, justice, and moral exhaustion. His presence migrates from page and screen into discourse, imagery, and identity formation. What makes this migration possible is not admiration alone, but utility. The Punisher offers a symbolic shortcut through ethical complexity. He condenses frustration into action. Where institutions appear slow, compromised, or abstract, he represents immediacy. Where responsibility feels diffused, he restores direct causality. This compression makes him culturally volatile. The skull operates as a visual condensation of this logic. It removes nuance. It announces outcome without process. In doing so, it becomes adaptable to contexts far removed from Frank Castle's original narrative. Law enforcement units, military groups, and civilians alike appropriate the symbol, often stripping it of narrative specificity while retaining its promise of decisive force. This appropriation reveals a cultural tension. The symbol is attractive precisely because it bypasses ethical mediation. It allows identification with power without responsibility for judgment. Violence becomes aesthetic, not contextual. The skull floats free of the war that produced it. Here, the character's meaning fractures. On one side, Frank Castle is read as indictment of systemic failure. On the other, he is consumed as endorsement of personal retribution. These readings coexist uneasily because the narrative itself refuses to resolve them. Popular culture amplifies this ambiguity. Media environments favor symbols that provoke reaction over those that demand reflection. Frank's silence, which within the narrative functions as ethical refusal, becomes outside it a blank surface for projection. Audiences fill the void with their own grievances, fears, and fantasies of control. This is where tribalism emerges. Supporters and critics of the Punisher do not merely debate a character. They signal allegiance to competing moral frameworks. One prioritizes order through decisive force. The other defends process, even at the cost of inefficiency. Frank becomes shorthand for these positions, flattening the complexity of both. The city within the narrative mirrors this dynamic. Citizens who feel unprotected interpret his actions as necessary correction. Those invested in institutional legitimacy experience him as existential threat. The conflict becomes symbolic rather than tactical. It organizes perception rather than territory. The most unsettling aspect of this cultural impact is how easily Frank's logic integrates into existing power structures. His methods, initially positioned as external to the system, are selectively absorbed. Militarized policing, expanded surveillance, preemptive force. The state adopts fragments of his approach while condemning the whole. This selective adoption preserves legitimacy while escalating force. It allows institutions to appear responsive without confronting the ethical rupture Frank represents. In this sense, the Punisher does not remain outside the system. He reshapes it from the margins inward. The audience is implicated in this process. Consumption of the character becomes a rehearsal for moral positioning. Identification does not require agreement with every action. It requires recognition of the frustration that fuels them. The war Frank cannot stop resonates because many recognize its shape within their own cultural environment. This resonance is amplified by contemporary conditions: fragmented authority, eroded trust, perpetual crisis. In such contexts, the fantasy of total coherence holds appeal. Frank Castle embodies coherence taken to its extreme, unburdened by negotiation or compromise. Yet the narrative resists turning him into a solution. It consistently portrays his effectiveness as inseparable from collateral collapse. Every reduction in visible crime corresponds with increased ambient fear. Every display of control accelerates systemic hardening. The war spreads rather than ends. This tension gives the character durability. He is not exhausted by critique because critique confirms his premise. The system is broken. Violence persists. Meaning is fragile. Frank does not deny these truths. He embodies them. Symbolically, the Punisher functions as a mirror held too close. He reflects impulses societies prefer to externalize: desire for retribution, distrust of institutions, longing for moral clarity without ambiguity. The discomfort arises not from his brutality alone, but from recognition. Culturally, this places the character in a precarious position. He can be mobilized in service of authority or rebellion. He can signal resistance or enforcement. The narrative offers no mechanism to stabilize his meaning. This instability is not accidental. It mirrors the unresolved ethical tension at the core of the character. Frank Castle does not resolve the question of justice through violence. He suspends it in perpetual action. The culture that consumes him inherits that suspension. The Punisher persists because he cannot be fully integrated or fully rejected. He occupies a liminal space where moral certainty and moral collapse coexist. That space remains relevant because the conditions that produce it persist. The war Frank Castle cannot stop is not only his own. It is the ongoing cultural struggle to reconcile desire for order with recognition of its cost. His presence keeps that struggle visible, uncomfortable, and unresolved. This is why the symbol endures, even as interpretations shift. It does not offer peace. It offers exposure. What remains is not closure, but residue. And residue has weight. The final state of the conflict is not an ending, but a sediment. Frank Castle does not reach resolution because resolution would require a transformation he cannot permit. The war remains active not through escalation, but through continuity. What is formed is a stable psychological and cultural configuration that no longer depends on momentum to persist. Frank survives as function rather than character. His interior life, once crucial to understanding his actions, becomes secondary to the role he occupies. He no longer needs narrative justification because his presence itself explains his persistence. The war does not ask why it continues. It only demands that it does. This is the core of his legacy, not victory or defeat, but fixation. Frank Castle represents a point at which moral coherence hardens into immobility. He does not grow. He does not heal. He does not decay. He remains, carrying a single logic forward through changing environments that must constantly adapt around him. The city adapts by normalizing what once seemed exceptional. Militarization becomes routine. Surveillance expands quietly. Preemptive force gains rhetorical legitimacy. The very institutions that opposed Frank adopt fragments of his approach while preserving procedural language to mask the shift. This absorption does not validate him. It confirms his diagnosis. The system could not remain what it was once exposed. It could only evolve toward the logic it publicly rejected. Frank did not corrupt it. He revealed its direction under pressure. Criminal ecosystems adapt as well. They become smaller, quieter, less visible. Violence does not disappear. It changes texture. It becomes intimate, impulsive, harder to trace. The absence of hierarchy produces fragility rather than peace. In this environment, innocence becomes harder to define. Responsibility disperses. Fear loses focus. The war Frank fights no longer has a clear enemy because the conditions that sustain harm are woven into ordinary life. Frank remains operational within this ambiguity because ambiguity is external to his structure. He does not require moral consensus. He requires continuity of threat. As long as harm persists, his logic remains intact. Culturally, this crystallization solidifies his role as myth rather than message. He is no longer interpreted as cautionary or aspirational in isolation. He becomes diagnostic, a figure used to read the state of collective tolerance for violence and control. When the skull reappears in new contexts, it signals more than aggression. It signals exhaustion with mediation. A desire to collapse distance between cause and consequence, a refusal to wait. This legacy is unsettling because it does not age out. It does not belong to a specific political moment or cultural cycle. It reemerges wherever trust in institutions erodes faster than alternatives can form. Frank Castle endures because he offers no future. He offers persistence. In a world saturated with promises of progress that fail to materialize, persistence can appear honest. The narrative never redeems him, but it does not erase him either. It leaves him where he began, moving through territory that cannot contain him and cannot remove him without becoming something else. The ethical question he embodies remains unresolved, because resolving it would require accepting limits to justice that many are unwilling to name. Frank refuses those limits absolutely. That refusal is his defining feature. In the aftermath, the war remains distributed. It lives in policy decisions, cultural symbols, and everyday assumptions about safety and force. Frank Castle becomes less visible, but more influential. He stands as a reminder that coherence, when detached from restraint, does not collapse under its own weight. It reshapes everything around it. The war he cannot stop is not sustained by hatred or grief anymore. It is sustained by consistency, and consistency, once established, is difficult to dislodge.